Hello and welcome to DroiX. Today we are checking out two brand new AMD 5800U models from ONEXPLAYER. The ONEXPLAYER AMD and the ONEXPLAYER Mini. We will unbox them, check out their features and run some system and games benchmarks, followed by some game and emulator testing. Let's start with unboxing the ONEXPLAYER Mini. Inside there is the ONEXPLAYER Mini, which we will take a closer look at in a moment. Next we have a quick start guide. There's not much in it, to be fair. There's a bit of English text but you don't really need it. Inside the first box is a USB power supply. We will include the correct adapter for your country when ordering. And last but not least, there is a USB Type-C charge cable. And moving on to the larger ONEXPLAYER AMD model. Inside there is the ONEXPLAYER AMD model, which we will also take a closer look at shortly. There is a quick start guide. This one has a bit more information and more English language text. And inside the box are a USB power supply and USB Type-C charge cable. As before, we will include the correct power adapter for your country. The ONEXPLAYER AMD measures 11.3 by 5.1 by 0.9 inches. The ONEXPLAYER Mini measures 10.23 by 4.1 by 0.9 inches. The AMD screen is 8.4 inches with a 2560 by 1600 resolution. The mini screen is 7 inches with a 1920 by 1200 resolution. Both devices essentially look the same on the front. You have dual analog sticks, a D-pad and gaming buttons. On the bottom right area there is a difference with one button. On the ONEXPLAYER AMD the button is a turbo button to easily increase the TDP. On the Mini it is replaced with a night mode feature that reduces the fan speed and noise. Both models have the standard left and right shoulder and trigger buttons. The AMD model has two USB Type-C ports on the top. The Mini has one on the top and one on the bottom of the device. Both have a USB 3 port. On the ONEXPLAYER AMD there is a kickstand to keep the device upright on your desk. There is a power button that doubles as a fingerprint sensor for fast logging into Windows. And you can also find the volume up and down buttons as well as a dedicated volume mute button. Both models feature the AMD Ryzen 7 5800U running up to 4.4 GHz with a default TDP of 25 watts. It comes with 16 gigs of LPDDR4X RAM and a choice of 1 or 2 TB of M.2 NVMe storage. They feature fast Wi-Fi 6 support and Bluetooth 5 for wireless connectivity. The ONEXPLAYER AMD has a 15,300 mAh battery. In our tests it lasted 5 hours 50 minutes on idle and 1 hour 48 on full load running Cinebench. Whilst running Cinebench we measured a maximum 66 decibels fan noise and 46 degrees temperature. The ONEXPLAYER Mini has a 12,600 mAh battery. It lasted around 6 hours 10 minutes on idle and 1 hour 57 on full load. We measured a maximum of 66 decibels fan noise and 44 degrees temperature. We start the system benchmarks with PassMark running at 4K resolution at 20 watts TDP to keep in line with our previous handheld tests. PassMark performs a series of tests on the CPU, GPU, RAM and storage to push them to the maximum performance. We get a score of 4,734 on the ONEXPLAYER AMD and a higher score of 5,073 on the ONEXPLAYER Mini. There's a noticeable difference in the scores here, which will be interesting to see if it continues throughout the tests. Our next test is with PCMark running at 4K with 20 watts TDP. PCMark runs a series of tests based on your more day-to-day usage of a PC. These include tasks ranging from web browsing, speed of loading software, working with large office documents and more. With the ONEXPLAYER AMD, we get a score of 5641, and with the ONEXPLAYER Mini, we get a score of 5687. The two scores are pretty much the same, which is good to see. 3DMark runs a series of tests with the CPU and GPU to see how well it performs for graphics related tasks. These include image processing and of course gaming. We are running the tests at 4K resolution and at 11, 20 and 35 watts TDP to see how the performance changes with different TDPs. The ONEXPLAYER AMD scores 952, 1304, 1460 across the 11, 20 and 35 watt TDPs. The ONEXPLAYER Mini scores 1075, 1366 and 1465 respectively across the three TDPs. There are differences in the 11 and 20 watt scores, and it's essentially the same at 35 watts. Putting this into a more visual form, we can see that the AMD 5800U and 5825U based devices have varying lower TDP scores, but at 35 watts they are scoring in the same ballpark. There is a nice increase in performance over the older generation of AMD based devices, ranging from 30% on the 4500U and 8% on the 4800U models. However, the king of 3DMark is still the ONEXPLAYER Mini Intel 1195G7 model, which has an excellent 1982 score. So that we can test and compare all of the handhelds fairly, we run our gaming benchmarks at 1280 by 800 irrespective of the handheld's resolution. The AMD's native resolution is 2560 by 1900 and the Mini is 1920 by 1200, which means more processing power is required to render the games at this resolution. We wouldn't be able to do a like for like performance comparison. We start the gaming benchmarks with Forza Horizon 5 running at 1280 by 800 with the very low graphics settings. We are also testing at 11, 20 and 35 watts TDP to see the difference in performance. The ONEXPLAYER AMD scores 53, 77 and 87 frames per second, and the ONEXPLAYER Mini scores 51, 78 and 88 frames per second. These scores are almost identical, and if we were to run the test again it would likely be one frame either way for both. Comparing the scores to other Windows gaming handhelds at 20 watts TDP, we can see that the AMD and Mini take the lead over the Iron X models by a few frames. Do keep in mind that the Iron models were tested using slightly older Windows versions and drivers. This may result in a frame or two difference here or there. Next in our games benchmark is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Again, we're running at 1280 by 800 resolution on the default lowest graphics settings. On the ONEXPLAYER AMD we get scores of 40, 57 and 64 frames per second, and on the Mini we get 42, 55 and 59 frames per second. There's a bit of variation in the scores here, with the highest scores swapping between the two at different TDPs. In our comparisons, we can see that the 5800U and 5825U models are catching up to the ONEXPLAYER Intel model. We are not sure why the Mini had a lower 20 and 35 watt score. We only run each benchmark once to give it a fair chance. In our Street Fighter V benchmark, we check the average frame rate at the end of the first match. We are running again at 1280 by 800 resolution on the maximum graphic settings at 11, 20 and 35 watts TDP. The ONEXPLAYER AMD scores 41.94, 55.35 and 58.88 frames per second average. The Mini scores 45.75, 56.35 and 58.91 FPS respectively. We can see a noticeable difference in the 11 watt TDP scores and next to nothing in 20 and 35 watts. In our handheld comparison, we can see that none of the AMD devices can still hit 60 frames per second. but they are getting closer with each new model. Overall, the 5800U scores are similar at 20 and 35 watts TDP. Our last games benchmark is Final Fantasy XIV, which we are running at 1280 by 800 on the maximum graphic settings. The ONEXPLAYER AMD scores 4005, 5250 and 5871. The ONEXPLAYER Mini scores 4383, 5359 and 5930. At 11 watts TDP, there is quite a large difference between the AMD and Mini. As the TDP goes higher, we can see the scores balancing out. In our comparison, we can see that the 5800U and 5825U models are roughly on par. But again, the Intel 1195 G7 takes the lead by far with a 27% difference in score. A brief look at the game's benchmark scores to compare them with other AMD and Intel based handhelds at 20 watts. The ONEXPLAYER AMD and Mini do quite well overall, with competitive scores in the game's benchmarks. The system benchmarks are however a little lower than the Ionier Next Pro model. This is likely a difference in RAM and storage speeds which are used by IA and ONEXPLAYER. As to which model out of the AMD Mini is best, you do have a few things to consider, such as the larger screen, higher resolution and fingerprint sensor on the AMD model. But then the Mini does have an overall slight increase in performance over the AMD. Both are great handhelds in their own right, so it may come down to personal preference which is best suited for you. We will finish up the video with a brief look at some gameplay and emulator footage, which are set up to be playable rather than cranking everything up to maximum. We tried a variety of games and found the performance to be pretty much the same as the Ionier Next Pro. With Elden Ring, we are playing at 1280 by 800 with a mix of mostly low and some medium graphics settings, and we're getting very playable frame rates. You can lock the frame rate to 30 and increase the graphics settings a little. With Forza Horizon 5, we're also running at 1280 by 800 with the lowest graphics settings. We know from the benchmarks that we got well over 60 frames per second. The gameplay was super smooth when locked to 60. You can, if you wanted to, go to higher graphics settings. We wanted to try a game on the ONEXPLAYER AMD's native resolution of 2560 by 1600. The gameplay is just fine with no issues on LEGO Star Wars, running at medium settings. But with some other games you wouldn't get the same experience with the native resolution. The emulation performance is on par with the 5825U powered Ionier Next Pro, and we get some good results. Both models are more than capable of emulating all of the classic 8, 16 and 32-bit consoles. Moving on to the more recent consoles, we get some good performance. But please remember that the emulators we are showing are still in active development and may not be fully optimised. Original Xbox emulation is spot on. You can enjoy compatible games at full speed, and you can usually increase the rendering resolution for improved visuals. The Citra emulator also runs amazingly well. You can of course change the display to show one screen in a larger view or full screen, or show both as we're doing. We have no issues with performance here. For PlayStation 2, the performance is amazing. You can enjoy games with higher rendering resolutions and still keep a stable 60 frames per second. The games really do look amazing on the ONEXPLAYER's displays. For PlayStation 3 emulation, as with on all handhelds, there are some performance issues. It can depend on the game you are playing as well as the actual emulator's compatibility. We are running WipeOut HD with a locked 30 frames per second and it runs great. And we finish off with the RyuJinx emulator. Again, this is still in active development, so performance may vary. But we tried a bunch of games and they were running at full speed or at least playable speeds. That wraps up our review of the ONEXPLAYER AMD and Mini models. We hope you have enjoyed it. You can learn more about both models and order yours today on our stores at droix.co.uk and droix.net. Don't forget to subscribe if you have not already. It helps to grow this channel and you can keep up to date with our latest videos. Thanks for watching and we hope to see you back again in our next video.